Okay. So Lyme disease prevention. There's several things that we can do, and I'll talk about each in more detail. But I think first, in order to prevent Lyme disease, we need to recognize when we are at risk. And then we need to avoid being bitten by ticks, check for ticks and remove any that we find, watch for symptoms of Lyme disease, and then consider antibiotics after a tick bite. So the first step is to know when we're at risk. And as I mentioned, ticks and Lyme disease are in central New York. Ticks are active above 45 degrees Fahrenheit, although I have read several, some say 45 degrees, some say 40, some say 32 degrees. But they're active in a little bit warmer weather. But even in the winter, when you have a warmer day, when you have a thaw, or this winter, most of the winter, then ticks are out and about. So it's not just in the summer or the spring and fall. Ticks hang out in vegetation. They'll crawl to the top of long stranded grass or some other bit of vegetation, and they'll wait for an animal or a person to come along. They have little hooks on their arms, and so they wait with their arms outstretched, and then when some animal brushes by, then they grab on and start looking for a meal. And the ticks will look for a place to bite, and then they'll feed on the blood for several days. So ticks feed on small mammals like mice and chipmunks, as well as larger mammals like deer and pets and people. And our pets can pick up ticks while they're outside and even bring them indoors into our own environment. So you could occasionally have ticks in your house as well. To further understand our risk from ticks and what we can do about it, we'll look at the tick life cycle. So a mother tick lays about 2,000 to 3,000 eggs in the spring. And let's see, if the mother has Lyme disease, she doesn't pass it on to most of her eggs, but about 1% do hatch with Lyme disease. So 1% of 2,000 to 3,000 is 20 to 30 of them. So they hatch in the spring, and then the larva comes out and is looking for a meal in the spring and the summer. And they generally feed on a small mammal like a mouse. And this is where Lyme disease is perpetuated, because Lyme disease can grow and thrive in mice. So even if the majority of the ticks don't have Lyme disease at the start, when they feed on the mouse with Lyme disease, then they get it. Even if the mouse is Lyme-free and you have that 1% feeding on the mouse, then the rest of the larva also feeding on the mouse will get the Lyme through the mouse. And then, so that's how a large portion of the tick population gets Lyme disease. So once the larva has a blood meal, then it drops off and it molts into a nymph. And the nymph lies dormant through the fall and the spring, fall and winter. And then in the spring, it's hungry. So the nymph is looking for a meal in the spring and summer. And it might latch onto anything, small mammals or people or pets. And then once it has a meal, it drops off and it molts into an adult. And the adult tick is looking for a meal that fall. And they often go on deer, and they'll mate on the deer as well as get their meal. And then the female uses that blood meal in order to lay her eggs in the spring. But if the adults were not able to get a meal in the fall, then they'll be looking for one in the spring as well. So, just to review, in the first year, the tick lays eggs. They hatch. The larva is looking to feed in the spring and the summer. Then turns into a nymph, which is dormant through fall and winter. And the nymph is looking to feed in the spring and summer. And then the adult is looking to feed in the fall and possibly the next spring, or the winter if it's warm. Now the mice, as I mentioned, can carry the Lyme bacteria within them, as well as the shrews, chipmunks, squirrels, foxes, and I've even read that robins may be able to do that as well. But the deer body is not, it's not good for the Lyme disease, so ticks biting on a deer don't actually get Lyme from the deer, and the deer don't really experience Lyme disease either. So the deer and raccoons and catbirds, they don't perpetuate Lyme disease, although the deer are an important part of the tick life cycle, because that's where a lot of them mate. Okay, so with that information, then we can look at where ticks will be prevalent. So we look at where deer go. Those will be places where ticks will be present a lot. So the protected grassy or leafy areas, overgrown fruit tree orchards, or trails through the woods, deer trails, are places where you'll find a lot of ticks. If you have deer wandering into your yard, they could be bringing ticks in with them as well. And then places like brush piles, rock walls, wood piles, rotting stumps or logs, those are places where your mice and your chipmunks like to nest, and they're moist areas, great for ticks. They hang out there a lot. And then where the rodents feed, at a compost pile or under a bird feeder, especially if there's some ground cover. You might get a lot of ticks in those areas as well. Another way that you could assess your risk is by doing this flagging for ticks, where you attach a piece of white felt to a pole and you drag it around in places where you'd expect to find ticks. And every so often you look at it and see if you caught any or grabbed any ticks. And then based on how many you find per hour, that can help you determine how much of a tick problem you have. For specific instructions on how often to check the flag and where to drag it around, you could go to ticktubes.com, and they have a manual there that tells you all about it. But this isn't necessary to mitigate your risk of Lyme disease. I mean, you could just consider where ticks are most likely to be, as I mentioned before, in places where the deer and the rodents are. So you could act based on that. But if you're really interested in getting some data and seeing if what you're doing will make a difference, then you might be interested in this. So after knowing when we're at risk, then we can take measures to avoid being bitten by ticks. And there's two main ways to do this. The first is by changing the environment around your home to make it less friendly to ticks. And you do that with drier landscaping, managing those tick-carrying animals, and separating your property into a tick-free zone and a tick zone. And then the other way to avoid tick bites is to do things on your person to prevent being bitten. So things you can do around your house and in your lawn and on your property. One of the things is to mow your lawn often, because ticks do better in longer grass. It's moister, so keeping it short is better, and it makes it so the rodents don't have as much cover to run around as well. Remove brush, leaf litter, tall grass, also rodent and tick places. You can trim the tree branches and shrubs around your lawn edge to let in more sunlight, because ticks like a moist environment, and they don't like direct sunlight. That tends to dry them out, and they don't do well in sunlight. Don't use ground cover plants, because that's a type of moist landscaping. as well as you could use mulches around your plants to make things drier, and have some sort of gravel pathways so that people walking along aren't brushing up against plants. And then you might also consider other areas like that around your house, decking, tile, gravel, to put those materials in some living areas around your house, just so that there's less contact with vegetation and that it's more dry. And container plantings are also a drier landscaping technique. If you have woodland on your property, then widening the trails can help reduce contact with ticks, because they're generally along the edges of the trails. So the wider the trail, the less vegetation contact you'll have as you walk along them. So that'll help. Another method that's recommended is to create a border between woodlands and your lawn out of wood chips, mulch, or gravel. And this creates a drier zone, and it separates kind of the tick area in the woods and from your lawn. Ticks won't really, the black-legged deer tick won't really crawl more than 3 feet on its own. And so they don't really want to cross wood chips or mulch or gravel. And then in this picture here from the New York State Department of Health, they also recommend that you have a 3-yard tick migration zone, probably for any that come in on rodents or something like that. So you kind of have this zone around between woodlands in your yard, where you're not going to be hanging out, where you're not going to have your kids swing set. So you pull everything in closer to your house, your garden, you fence that in and try to keep deer out. So all your living activity would be closer to your house and in a tick-free zone. And the swing set, sandbox, stuff like that, put it on a wood chip, mulch, or gravel foundation so you don't have grasses growing up around it, which would be hospitable for ticks. Another thing you can do is address any stone walls on your property, because the rodents like to nest there. So if you have any, you could clean them up, reduce the vegetation around it, seal up openings, and if you have any openings around the base of your house, seal those up as well. And firewood is another place where those rodents like to nest. So they recommend moving it away from your house. I'm not sure if you are looking to heat with the wood. I'm not sure how far you really want to move it away. But stacking it neatly, keeping it drier, makes it less hospitable to the ticks. And, if you aren't moving it that far away from the house, you might consider putting it on the side of the house that's not the side where you're going to hang out or where your kids are going to play. So kind of separating that area. And then addressing the bird feeder. If you have one, you can move it away from the house, or you could try to keep the area underneath it clean. Don't let plants grow up under it. Try to discourage the rodents from coming along and hanging out under there.